I found a second phone hidden in his gym bag. It only had one contact saved, and it wasn't under a real name. I was doing laundry and found a receipt in his jacket pocket. Dinner for 2 at 11 p.m. on a night he told me he was working late. She told me she was sleeping over at her sister's. I called her sister to ask how the night went. Her sister asked me, "What sleepover?" I checked his location for the first time in 2 years. It said he was at the gym. The gym closed down 8 months ago. Hi, I'm Maya. On this channel, we analyze real relationship cases, cheating suspicions, red flags, am I overreacting questions. Today we're analyzing 4 different cheating suspicion cases. A hidden second phone, a late night receipt, a sleepover that never happened, a location that doesn't add up. In each one, we'll try to answer, is this normal or is it a red flag? If you have a relationship situation you'd like me to analyze anonymously in a future video, you can send it to the email in the description. Please remove real names, private details, and anything that could identify you or another person. This channel is not professional therapy. It's for relationship analysis and discussion. But your story may help someone else feel less alone. Let's get started. I found a second phone hidden in his gym bag. It only had one contact saved, and it wasn't under a real name. We've been married for 6 years. Last week, I was looking for his charger and found a second phone zipped inside his gym bag. It was password protected, but a message popped up on the lock screen. Just a heart emoji from a contact saved as work. Siri. He doesn't have a work contact. When I asked about the phone, he said it was for emergencies and got defensive fast. Now I can't stop thinking about that one contact. On the surface, this looks pretty clear. A second phone, hidden in a gym bag with a password on it. That alone would make most people uncomfortable. But let's slow down for a second. Some people genuinely do have a second phone for work, for privacy from intrusive group chats, or even for an old SIM card they're still using for 2-factor authentication. So, before we jump to conclusions, it's worth asking, is having a second phone by itself automatically a red flag? Not necessarily. Plenty of people have legitimate reasons to keep a separate device. The phone itself isn't the story here. What happened next is, here's where it gets more interesting. The phone had a notification on the lock screen, a heart emoji from a contact saved simply as work. Now think about that for a second. If this were truly a work phone, why would a coworker be sending heart emojis? And more importantly, why would that contact be saved under a generic, vague label instead of an actual name? People who are hiding something often use vague labels on purpose, names like work, mom too, or even just initials, so that if someone glances at their phone, nothing looks unusual. That's not proof of anything by itself, but it is a pattern worth noticing. What's even more telling here isn't the phone or the message, it's the reaction. When she asked about it, he didn't explain calmly. He got defensive and fast. In healthy relationships, when one partner asks a reasonable question, even an uncomfortable one, the other partner usually responds with some level of openness, even if they're a little annoyed. A fast, defensive reaction to a simple question often signals that the person feels caught off guard. Like they were not prepared for this conversation to happen at all. So the real issue here isn't really about the existence of a second phone. It's about secrecy, mismatched explanations, and a defensive response to a fair question. Those 3 things together start to shift this from unusual into concerning. Let's go through this carefully, because context matters a lot here. Could there be an innocent explanation? In theory, yes. Maybe it really is an old work phone he forgot to mention, and the message was from an old coworker who still has his number saved with an affectionate emoji as a joke. People do weird things with old contacts sometimes. But here's the thing, when people make innocent decisions, they usually don't go out of their way to hide them. If this phone were truly innocent, the more natural reaction would be something like, "Oh yeah, that's my old work phone. I keep meaning to get rid of it. Let me show you." Instead, what happened was defensiveness and a vague explanation that didn't really answer the question. This is where the gray area starts to narrow. One unexplained item, a phone, a message, a receipt, can often be explained away. But when you put together secrecy, plus a vague contact label, plus a defensive reaction, you're no longer looking at a single odd detail. You're looking at a pattern of behavior that's designed to avoid a conversation. That's the difference between something being a one-off oddity and something being a red flag. A red flag isn't usually one big, dramatic event. It's often a small moment where someone's reaction tells you more than their words do. So what can someone actually do in this situation? The goal here isn't to start an interrogation or demand to unlock the phone. That usually leads to a fight, not an answer. Instead, the goal is to open a calm, direct conversation that gives the other person a chance to either explain themselves or reveal more through how they respond. A boundary statement that could work here is something like this. I found a second phone in your gym bag and I saw a message come through while I was holding it. I'm not trying to accuse you of anything, but I need you to actually explain this to me, calmly and with real details. If there's nothing going on, I want to understand it. And if there is something going on, I need to know that too. This kind of statement does a few important things. It states the facts without exaggeration. It doesn't call the other person a liar or a cheater, but it also doesn't pretend the issue is small. And most importantly, it puts the responsibility on them to either offer real clarity or to keep being vague, which in itself would be information. A second phone isn't automatically proof of anything. But secrecy, combined with a defensive reaction to a fair question, often says more than the phone itself ever could. So I want to ask you, if you found a hidden phone with a message like this, would you confront it directly, or would you wait and watch for more signs first? Let me know what you think in the comments. I was doing laundry and found a receipt in his jacket pocket. Dinner for 2 at 11 p.m. on a night he told me he was working late. Last Thursday, he texted saying he'd be home late because of a huge project deadline. He got home around midnight, exhausted, said he barely had time to eat. The next morning, doing laundry, I found a receipt in his jacket. A restaurant downtown, 11:14 p.m., 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine. When I brought it up, he said a coworker joined him to talk through the project, and he forgot to mention it. At first glance, this might look like a simple miscommunication. He was working late, he grabbed dinner with a coworker, and he forgot to mention it. People forget to mention things all the time, especially after a long, tiring day. So, on the surface, this is the kind of thing that could be completely explainable. Work dinners happen, especially during busy project periods. But here's where it gets a little more complicated. He didn't just forget to mention dinner. He specifically said he barely had time to eat. That's not a small detail. That's a direct statement that turned out to be untrue. And it wasn't just dinner. It was dinner at 11 p.m. with wine at a restaurant downtown, which doesn't exactly sound like a quick bite squeezed in between work tasks. So the visible problem here isn't really he had dinner with a coworker. It's that what he said happened and what actually happened don't match up. Let's think about why this matters beyond the dinner itself. When someone tells their partner a specific story, I barely had time to eat, I was buried in work, and the reality turns out to be a relaxed dinner with wine at 11 p.m., the issue isn't really about the meal. It's about the fact that a version of events was constructed, and it happened to leave out something he apparently didn't want to mention. This touches on something deeper than jealousy or possessiveness. It touches on the basic agreement that exists in most relationships. That when your partner tells you what their day looked like, you're getting something close to the truth. When that agreement gets quietly broken, even over something that might seem small, it chips away at the foundation that makes a partner feel safe being honest too. There's also the detail about who initiated this. He said the coworker joined him. But notice, we don't actually know who suggested the dinner, who picked the restaurant, or why a project conversation needed to happen over wine at 11 p.m. rather than, say, over coffee the next morning at work. None of these details are explained. And often, what's left unexplained is just as telling as what is said. So, is this a red flag, or could it genuinely be a gray area? Let's be fair here. Work dinners that run late do happen, and sometimes people genuinely do forget to mention small details when they're exhausted and just want to go to sleep. If this were a one-time thing with an honest explanation offered up front, something like, "Hey, I should have mentioned a coworker and I grabbed a late dinner to hash out the project. It ran longer than expected. That would be a completely different story. But that's not quite what happened. The information came out only after she found the receipt. That's an important distinction. When someone volunteers information, even slightly embarrassing information, it tends to build trust. When someone only explains after being confronted with evidence, it raises a different question. Would this have ever come up if she hadn't done laundry that day? This is where it shifts from might be nothing toward worth paying attention to. One unmentioned dinner, explained honestly, is a gray area. A dinner that was actively misrepresented, described as barely eating, when it was actually a late dinner with wine, and only clarified after physical evidence appeared, starts to look less like an oversight and more like a choice. To be clear, this still doesn't prove anything about what the dinner itself meant, but it does tell us something about how comfortable he is being transparent, and that's often more important than the dinner itself. So, what's a productive way to approach this? The instinct might be to focus on the coworker, who they are, what their relationship is like, whether this person is a threat. But honestly, that's probably not the most useful place to start. The more useful place to start is the gap between what he said and what actually happened. A boundary statement that could work here is something like this. When you told me you barely had time to eat because of work, and then I found a receipt for a dinner with wine at 11 p.m., that's the part that's bothering me. Not just the dinner itself, but that what you told me wasn't what happened. I need to be able to trust that when you tell me about your day, I'm getting the real picture, even if it includes things that feel awkward to bring up. This approach does something important. It's better one mer and your refuse kursao, one ner and sorsao. It separates the actual issue, which is honesty, from a side issue, which is the dinner itself. It also gives him a clear, fair way to respond. Either acknowledge the gap and explain why it happened, or continue minimizing it, which would itself be useful information. Sometimes the issue isn't the dinner, the receipt, or even the coworker. It's the quiet gap between the story someone tells and the story that's actually true. So here's what I want to know. If you found a receipt that contradicted what your partner told you, would you bring it up right away? Or would you wait to see if more details came out on their own? Tell me in the comments. She told me she was sleeping over at her sister's. I called her sister to ask how the night went. Her sister asked me, "What sleepover?" My girlfriend said she'd be staying at her sister's place Saturday night for a girls' night. Sunday morning, I called her sister to ask if they'd had fun. I wanted to plan a surprise based on whatever they talked about. Her sister sounded confused and said, "What sleepover? I haven't seen her in 2 weeks." When my girlfriend got home, I asked where she actually was. She just said, "Don't make this a thing." Let's start with what's on the surface here. She said she'd be at her sister's for a girls' night. That by itself is an extremely normal thing. People stay over at siblings' places all the time, especially for catching up or just having a relaxed weekend. If the story had ended there would be nothing to analyze at all. But the story didn't end there. He called the sister the next morning, not to check up, but with a completely innocent intention to plan a surprise. And the sister had no idea what he was talking about. She hadn't seen her in 2 weeks. So the visible problem isn't she stayed somewhere on a Saturday night. The visible problem is that the specific place she said she'd be wasn't where she actually was. And the person who was supposedly part of the plan didn't even know about it. This is one of those cases where the location itself almost doesn't matter. What matters is that an entire plan, a destination, a person, a reason, was described in detail, and none of it was true. That's different from someone simply not mentioning where they went. This was a constructed story with a specific person attached to it who wasn't even aware they were supposedly part of it. When someone builds a story that includes another person, especially someone close, like a sister, it tends to suggest some level of planning. It's one thing to vaguely say, "I'll be out with friends." It's another to specifically name a person, a location, and an activity, all of which turn out to be untrue. The level of detail here is part of what makes this stand out. And then there's the response when she got home. Instead of explaining where she actually was, she said, "Don't make this a thing. That single sentence does a lot of work. It doesn't answer the question. It doesn't acknowledge that the story didn't match reality. Instead, it shifts the focus onto him, as if asking a reasonable question is the actual problem, rather than the fact that the story he was told wasn't true. So where does this land, gray area or red flag? Let's think about what an innocent version of this could look like. Maybe plans changed at the last minute. Maybe she ended up somewhere else with different friends and didn't think to update him because it felt unimportant. People do sometimes change plans without realizing how it might look later. But here's the issue. Even in that more innocent version, the natural response when confronted would be something like, "Oh, plans changed last minute. I ended up at so-and-so's instead. Sorry I didn't update you." That's a simple, low-effort explanation, and most people would offer it immediately, especially once they realized their story didn't line up. Instead, what happened was a refusal to explain at all, combined with a statement that reframed the situation as him overreacting. That combination, a false, detailed story, plus a refusal to clarify, plus reframing the question as the problem, moves this well beyond plans just changed. This is the kind of pattern that, especially if it's not the first time something like this has happened, would reasonably be considered a red flag rather than a simple gray area. To be clear, none of this proves exactly what she was doing or who she was with, but it does show a willingness to construct a false story involving a third person and then avoid accountability when that story fell apart. That's less about the specific Saturday night and more about what it reveals about honesty in the relationship overall. In a situation like this, the temptation might be to focus on proving exactly where she was, almost like building a case. But realistically, the more important issue isn't the specific location. It's the fact that a false story was told, and when it unraveled, there was no real explanation, just a request to drop it. A boundary statement that could work here is something like this. "You told me you'd be at your sister's, and that wasn't true. She didn't even know about it. When I asked you about it, you told me not to make it a thing. But I'm not asking because I want to control where you go. I'm asking because what you told me wasn't true, and I need to understand why, and what that means for how honest we are with each other." This statement does something important. It doesn't get pulled into arguing about logistics or trying to catch details. It stays focused on the actual issue. A false story was told, and there's been no real acknowledgement of that. It also gives her a clear opening, either to be honest now or to continue deflecting, which would itself be telling. Sometimes the most revealing part of a situation isn't where someone actually was. It's what they were willing to make up and how they react when that story falls apart. So I want to know, if your partner's story didn't match reality and their only response was, "Don't make this a thing," would that be enough for you to push further, or would you let it go? Share your thoughts below. Now let's hear another case. I checked his location for the first time in 2 years. It said he was at the gym. The gym closed down 8 months ago. We've shared our locations with each other since we got engaged, but I never really check it. It always felt like an invasion of privacy. Last night, for no real reason, I opened the app. It showed him at Iron Peak Fitness, right where he said he was. The problem is, I drove past that building last month. It's been closed for renovation since at least 8 months ago. I haven't said anything yet. At first, this almost seems like a non-issue. And honestly, the way it starts, it kind of is. She checked his location, and it matched exactly what he told her. He said he was at the gym, and the app showed him at the gym. If the story stopped there, this wouldn't even be a case worth discussing. Most people would look at that and think, okay, everything checks out. But here's the twist. That specific gym, Iron Peak Fitness, has been closed for renovation for at least 8 months. So the visible problem isn't that his location didn't match what he said. It's that it matched a place that, according to her own observation, doesn't actually exist as an open gym anymore. Something here doesn't add up. Either the app is showing outdated information, or he's somewhere else, and the location is being represented in a way that just happens to align with what he told her. This case is interesting because it's not about catching someone in an obvious lie. It's about a small inconsistency that creates more questions than it answers. Let's think about what could cause a phone to show a location at a building that's closed. One possibility is completely technical. Location apps can sometimes show outdated pins, especially if a location was saved a long time ago, or if GPS is pulling from a cached location rather than a live one. That's a real possibility, and it's worth taking seriously before assuming anything else. But there's another layer here that's less about the technology and more about the relationship pattern. She mentioned that they've had location sharing on since they got engaged, but she never really checks it because it felt like an invasion of privacy. That detail matters. It suggests that this is a relationship where, up until this point, there's been a baseline level of trust that didn't require verification. Last night, for whatever reason, that baseline shifted. She felt the need to check. That shift itself might be worth paying attention to, separate from the gym issue. Sometimes people don't consciously decide to start checking. Something subtle, a feeling, a small inconsistency in conversation prompts it. The location discrepancy might be the first concrete thing she's noticed, but it's worth asking whether it's really the first thing she's felt. So, red flag or gray area? Right now, this is almost entirely gray area, and it's important to say that clearly. A location app showing an outdated or incorrect PIN is genuinely common. Phones cache locations. Apps don't always update in real time. And a closed gym could still be registered as an active location in some mapping databases. On its own, this is not strong evidence of anything. However, and this is important, gray areas don't stay gray forever. They're often the starting point for a conversation, not the ending point. The real test here isn't the location itself, it's what happens next. If she brings this up casually, something like, "Hey, random question, is Iron Peak still open? I thought it closed?" And he responds naturally, maybe even confused himself, that's one outcome. If instead he becomes defensive, avoids the topic, or gives an explanation that raises more questions than it answers, that would shift this from probably nothing towards something to keep an eye on. Right now, she hasn't said anything yet, and that's actually the most important detail in this entire case. Not the gym, not the app, but the fact that this is sitting unspoken. Unspoken inconsistencies tend to grow heavier the longer they're carried alone. Given that this is genuinely still in gray area territory, the approach here should be low pressure and curious rather than confrontational. The goal isn't to accuse, it's to open a small, natural conversation that either resolves the question or reveals more. A boundary statement that could work here is something like this. I noticed something a little odd on the location app last night. It showed you at Iron Peak, but I thought that place closed down a while ago. I'm probably just misremembering, but I wanted to ask you about it, just so I'm not sitting on a weird thought for no reason. This kind of statement is intentionally light. It frames the question as her own possible mistake, which removes pressure from him and gives him room to respond naturally. But it also opens the door. His reaction, whether relaxed or defensive, will tell her more than the location itself ever could. Sometimes the smallest inconsistencies aren't proof of anything on their own, but they're the moment someone starts paying closer attention to things they used to take for granted. So I want to ask you, if you noticed a small detail like this that didn't quite add up, would you bring it up casually like this, or would you wait and watch quietly first? Let me know in the comments. So let's bring all four of these together: a hidden second phone, a receipt that didn't match a story, a sleepover that never happened, and a location pin that didn't quite make sense. On the surface, these look like four completely different situations. Different evidence, different people, different levels of seriousness. But if you look closely, there's a common thread running through all of them. In almost every case, the object itself, the phone, the receipt, the call, the location, wasn't really the main issue. The real issue was the gap between what was said and what was true, and how each person reacted when that gap was noticed. Some of these reactions were defensive, some were dismissive, and one, the gym case, hasn't even happened yet. That last one is a reminder that not every inconsistency is a crisis. Sometimes it's just a small thread worth gently pulling on, calmly, and without assuming the worst. If there's one takeaway from today, it's this. Trust isn't usually broken by one big moment. It's usually built or worn down by how people respond to small, uncomfortable questions. Which case hit closest to home for you? If you're going through a situation similar to one of these, or you have your own relationship story you'd like me to analyze anonymously, you can send it to the email in the description. Please keep it anonymous. No real names, addresses, or identifying personal details. I may use selected stories in future videos to analyze relationship dynamics, patterns, and red flags. This is not therapy, and I can't provide personal crisis counseling. But sometimes seeing a situation clearly is the first step toward understanding what's really happening. I'm Maya. See you in the next one.